on to Mr. Fast.
Thank you. How many free trade agreements does Canada have?
Well, it depends on how you count them to some
How many countries does Canada have free trade agreements with?
Well,
51?
I would say 51 or 53,
All right.
somewhere in that range, yes.
Okay. How many foreign investment promotion and protection agreements does Canada have?
I'm guessing a bit here, but I think it's in the range of 30 to 35. I don't know if anybody can.
Yeah.
14 free trade agreements with 51 countries. So we have that.
All right. We've got all those free trade agreements. We have all those FIPAs, as they're known. And virtually all of them have some sort of investor-state dispute settlement in them, correct?
Yeah, correct.
So now we have a renegotiation with Donald Trump after we've had years of Canada being a champion of ISDS because it protects Canadian companies when they have a dispute with respect to a foreign country changing the rules, acting in a discriminatory manner.
Right.
And now suddenly we get to the new NAFTA, and Canada says, oh, you know, we got to get rid of the ISDS, and wow, we've got a great win because we got rid of something that we've always championed. Can you explain to me that dynamic?
I can. When we look at investor-state dispute settlement, where that is of most value is with countries where we have limited faith in their court systems and with their ability to enforce agreements. So we have investor-state dispute settlement with many Latin American countries. We have investor-state dispute settlement with some African countries, various Asian countries. And we've got a lot around the world. We tend to have less of an emphasis when we are dealing with countries that have established court systems where there's a respect for the rule of law, and we don't feel that same kind of threat. But when it comes to the U.S., if I can just add, we have had the experience through the course of NAFTA where we have been challenged by U.S. investors, as I mentioned, many times. We have had cases where Canadian investors did try to make moves towards challenging the U.S. The U.S. has had no cases against us. That simply wasn't working as an instrument between us and the U.S.
Okay, but the reality is eliminating ISDS, the Chapter 11, effectively means that Canadian companies now have to find their resort in the American court system, correct?
Well, we also have investment obligations that we've agreed to that can be pursued state to state. So
that's right.
Yes.
But for a state to engage on that requires typically something more than just a company being aggrieved. I think states are reluctant to take up one company's case. It certainly was my experience when I was in the trade role. But I'm just surprised that suddenly we've said, well, you know what? We had ISDS there. We felt it was important back when we negotiated the original Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which morphed into NAFTA. Chapter 11 stayed there. And suddenly Canada is of a different mind that we suddenly trust Donald Trump and the court system in the United States. You understand my difficulty. Let me follow up with another question, and that is this. It's already been mentioned that we have an obligation to present any trade agreement with a non-market economy to the United States and Mexico if we want to sign one. So basically, we're coming cap in hand to the United States, to Donald Trump, and saying, please, maybe sign a trade agreement with China. Now, the United States has an obligation going the other way, except they've already signed a managed trade agreement with China, at least phase one. So they no longer have to come to us, cap in hand, to ask us to review that agreement and ask for permission. I find that disturbing simply because I'm not aware of any other trade agreement that Canada has signed where we've agreed to those kinds of provisions, that we actually cede our sovereignty to two other countries to determine whether we can negotiate a free trade agreement with a country like China. Doesn't that concern you?
It doesn't actually, because I think, first of all, the new NAFTA is not yet in effect. So the agreement, this phase one agreement that the U.S. has reached with China, is not something that we could pursue, even if we wanted to, because the agreement's not into effect
That's
yet.
my point.
Neither, if we started to negotiate an agreement with China right now, the U.S. would have no avenue to pursue us because the agreement's not in effect. But I think the most important element of all this comes down to the recourse. And the recourse is simply reflecting an element, a provision in the agreement that already exists. You can withdraw from the agreement with 6 months' notice. So if the U.S. does something that we don't like, we can withdraw with 6 months' notice. If we do something the U.S. doesn't like, they can withdraw with 6 months' notice. This is primarily an optical issue that the U.S. insisted on because of their preoccupation with the notion of a non-market economy. The notion of a non-market economy doesn't really exist in Canada or in Mexico. We don't use those terms. But the U.S. was preoccupied with this issue. But it changes none of our legal obligations. It constrains us in no way from pursuing an FTA with a so-called non-market economy. So I don't think that there's a fundamental change in the way things work now with this provision.
Okay. Thank you very much. On to Ms. Spinayan, please.